Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Carolyn, and I'm your service leader for this morning. I'd like to welcome all of you to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of the Rappahannock. Whether you're here because worshiping with us is part of your routine, or whether you feel like our country has been stopped in its tracks and it's impossible to return to normalcy, on this morning we gather to proclaim that we belong to one another and that others belong to us. Broken hearts are welcome here. Anxious spirits are welcome here. Minds whirring faster than a racing engine, uncertain what to think. Stubborn egos that sometimes trips us up, cementing us to opinions. Fragile, shell-shocked souls, they are welcome here. All are welcome here. Not because everyone else's community feels that they have a responsibility to fix it with an easy solution. Not this community. This community has something far more fragile and far more powerful than that, and that is our need to be together, our need to reconnect to the life-giving source that moves within and among us, and our need to make one another a little bit braver and a little bit wiser before returning to the chaos of life. If ever there were a time for a candle in the darkness, this would be it. Using a spark of hope, kindle the flame of love, ignite the light of peace, and feed the flame of justice. Our opening words this morning are very brief, but I think they're useful and appropriate in the context of what Eddie is going to be talking about. They're a distillation of a book, an adult book that deals with how to learn tolerance, how to respect difference, how to not be afraid of difference. And it's a little poem called West Beast, East Beast. Upon an island hard to reach, the East Beast sits upon his beach. Upon the West Beach sits the West Beast. Each beach beast thinks he's the best beast. Which beast is best? Well, says the boy who found the island, I thought at first that the East was best and the West was worst. Then I looked again from West to East, and I liked the beast on the East Beach least. And now we come to our talk for this morning's service, and it will be presented by my husband, Eddie Correa, who both of us are members of the fellowship. And Eddie is an attorney in Washington, D.C., who has a practice and also is a law professor. And also, unrelated to law, he is an author. So I know many of you have heard him before, and as he mentioned, he'll be talking today about Eastern versus Western religion, Part 1. Why are they so different?
Thanks, Carol. This is not a regular reading. I wanted to introduce you to this timeline, which I put in your order of service. And by the way, your papers are due Friday. No, you don't have to write a paper. So, I was trying to understand how Buddhism and Hinduism in the East and Western religions, how did they emerge in the first place? So that's what I'm going to talk about today. This is the beginning of a three-part series on Eastern and Western religion. So this timeline is one way to sort of try to get the big picture of a very huge phenomenon in our Earth's existence. So it begins on the left, upper left, and you see the Vedas are the most ancient sacred scripture that we know about, the first Hindu scriptures. Maybe as early as 1500 BCE. That might be a little early, but possibly. And in the lower right-hand corner, you see the Reformation, 1517. So it's about a 3,000-year span. And a lot happened in those 3,000 years. But what I want to talk about later, I'm going to give you a chance to look at this timeline to sort of wrap your mind around it, is how we became so divided, how there were different ways of looking at the universe became so different. A lot of overlap, true, a lot of ethical concerns that we share in common, but really some different perspectives on how to understand us and the universe. Surprisingly, there's not as much interaction between the two columns in the far left and the three columns in the far right as you might expect. These are different parts of the world. The part on the left is India and to the east. And the part on the right is the Mediterranean, and then west to Europe, and then to North America. So I'll try to explain to the extent I can understand it, why we have these two directions in the universe. How did that happen? And if we can understand that, maybe we will understand each other better. Why do we have these different traditions in the first place? Part two is going to be about conceptions of the divine. And then part three is going to be about the goal or the end point of these different traditions. Let's go back to the timeline for a minute. What you see, Hinduism and Buddhism, Eastern religion, are on the far left. The very first sacred scripture, sacred text as far as we know, are the Vedas, followed by the Upanishads several hundred years later. Then I'll read something from the Bhagavad Gita, which is much later than that. But you see the vast differences in time. If we say the Vedas were written in 1500, the Buddha himself didn't live until the 6th century. That's 1,000 years before Buddhism became, you could call it an offshoot of Hinduism, perhaps, but certainly influenced by it. Judaism, the legends of Abraham were 2,000 and 1,500. That's one supposition. Babylonian exile in the 6th century, about the same time the Buddha was born. But you don't have the Torah written until maybe 600 to 400 BCE. So that is more than a millennium after the Vedas, when the Jewish sacred text, as far as we know, the first Jewish sacred text. Then Jesus doesn't come along for several hundred years after that. And then we have the development of Christianity, and then Muhammad is born 600 years later. So you're having these vast differences in time for these traditions to emerge, all influenced by the other. I put the Greeks in there. You may wonder, what the heck are they doing in there? And that's because particularly Plato and Aristotle had a quite an influence on early Christianity. So I want to mention that. But when you try to see how the cultures are developing, Homer's poems, of course there were verbal legends before this, but as far as we know, when they were written, maybe 750 to 650 BCE, that is if you remember the Iliad and the Odyssey, that's a different view of the universe, an entirely different view of the universe, which is going on in parallel with the Jewish development around the Mediterranean and with the Hindu development in India. All that's happening at the same time. Let's briefly consider what was going on before this. Humans have been around, Homo sapiens, let's say 300,000 BC, 300,000 years before Jesus. When did religion start? We really don't know. One way of dating it is what is called grave goods, where archaeologists have found graves that have objects in them. The presumption is that the people who buried that corpse had some notion of life after death. So that's one way, and maybe a very simplistic way of thinking about religion. That might have occurred as early as 100,000 BCE. But after that, as the Homo sapiens developed intellectually, we don't have written works, of course. Writing didn't come along until about 3000 BC. So we have art, we have artifacts. What we think, or what historians think, is very early religion was more in the nature of animism. That term animism usually means there are spirits. You view spirits in rocks and in the rivers and in objects in the world, and they're alive somehow. They transcend us. Probably not anthropomorphic gods. That seems to be a later development. So out of that, along comes the Vedas and the first ideas of Hinduism. And the first notion of what is to become Brahman, the idea, the overarching entity. Probably Brahman early on was more in the nature of an anthropomorphic god. We're not sure about that. But that's not where Brahman is, and that's not what Brahman became. Brahman became existence in itself, being in itself. Now, think about the dividing point there, where Hindus began to think of this overarching Brahman as all of reality. Whereas over in the Mediterranean, when we got to the Torah finally, God is very personal. Remember Exodus, or start with Genesis. God comes to visit Eden, and he walks in the garden in the cool of the day. Now that is a very personal idea. That's a huge dividing line, the dividing point to serve as the basis for these two great branches of religion. Another key dividing point is, where do the answers come from? The Hindu tradition, both early on and still today, is the answers come from within. They come from reflection, they come from meditation, but they don't come from the priest. They don't come from necessarily the reading the scripture even. They come from within. Now, eventually there's a notion of a soul, but there's another dividing point, because what the soul became for Eastern religion is really something that goes on and on from one person to the next. Hindus are more specific about it. Your soul is transferred to another soul. Sometimes the Buddhist tradition, although it thinks languages in terms of reincarnation, it's really not the individual soul that's living from one person to the next, but just life itself that's being transferred. But it's something that's not unique to an individual. Plato himself believed in the soul, a much more abstract notion. Plato believed the soul pre-existed any individual. But eventually, soul for Christians became very particularized to an individual. Another great turning point. The Eastern way is to tend to view things as a universal. Tends to say we are all related somehow. We're all part of one. The Western tradition is very individualistic. The soul belongs to one person. Another idea is what's more important, your actions or your mind? The Eastern tradition is to say your mind is the beginning. Actions will follow. Good actions will follow. But it all begins with the mind. This is from the Bhagavad Gita, which is maybe 100, give or take 100 BCE to 100 CE, but around there, much later than the Vedas. But this can be taken to be a representation of Hinduism at the time. I don't know if you remember, if you ever read the beautiful, beautiful poem. The story is about a prince, Arjuna, who's getting ready to go into battle, and Krishna, who's his chariot driver. But a chariot driver is really a combination of Brahman and Atman. Atman is that soul. And the insight or the perspective of Hinduism is ultimately Atman and Brahman are the same. So this is the chariot driver who's the source of wisdom for Arjuna. He says, yes, the right act is far less than the right thinking mind. Seek refuge in thy soul. Have there thy heaven. Scorn them that follow virtue for her gifts. The mind of pure devotion, even here, cast equally aside good deeds and bad, passing above them into pure devotion. Devote thyself with perfect meditation, comes perfect act. And the right-hearted rise more certainly because they seek no gain. Forth from the bands of bodies step by step to highest seats of bliss. The Christian tradition later, and the Western tradition in general, really focuses on, of course, belief, but acts, whereas the Eastern perspective has been, the answers are internal and it all begins with what's going on in your mind. Let me talk about Buddhism for a minute, and keep in mind the vast time scale here. We're talking about Vedas in 1500. We're talking about Buddha not alive until the 6th century. But you could see it as an offshoot. The Buddha himself was born in India, no doubt born as a child, as a Hindu. Legend was he was a prince protected from poverty and all suffering, but he longed to see the real world. And he went out over a series of evenings or days and saw suffering, and he saw illness, and he saw death. And he decided he was going to commit himself to decide what to do about all that. And some things that Buddhism rejected, maybe in a very healthy way, it rejected the caste system. I mean, one of the problems with Hinduism was really a rigid caste system. You are what you're born, where you're born, and that's where you stay. So the Buddha, I think we can, when I say Buddhism, I'm talking about millions of people with many, many different sects, so I'm going to have to oversimplify, so forgive me for that. But if we go back to the heart of early Buddhism, we can say it's condensed into the Four Noble Truths, for starters. And there are these, that life includes but is not limited to suffering, dissatisfaction, and discontent. Life's full of suffering. The second truth, the root cause of this suffering is craving and desire. The third truth, it's possible to end the suffering and achieve liberation by letting go of craving and attachment so that one can reach a state of enlightenment or nirvana, which is the ultimate cessation of dissatisfaction. How do you get there? Through the Noble Eightfold Path, which I'll mention in a minute. But just think about the difference between that and Christianity, and Islam too. If you read the Quran and read passages about the paradise, or the Bible is not quite as specific about what heaven is like. The Quran gets pretty specific about it, but if you think about traditional Christians, heaven and paradise are the satisfaction of all desires. You get everything you want. It's bliss. Whereas for the Buddhist, what's the end point? It's giving up desire. The Noble Eightfold Path, and most of this is, I think, begins with the mind. Now, you'll see how actions are related. What's the path? The right views, be free from prejudice, the right thoughts, the right speech, no harmful speech. Now, the right conduct, the right livelihood, those are very action-oriented, and the right effort. But again, returning to the right mindfulness and the right meditation. Now, this is all happening in India and to the east, with their own trade routes and their own series of interactions. What's going on the other side of the world at that time? Around the Mediterranean, that's where the trade routes are. That's where the intellectual activity is. And that's why I included the Greeks. Now, I don't want to talk too much about the Greeks, but why did I mention them at all? Partly because, or mostly because, they really helped shape the development of Christianity. Now, as we'll see, Christians changed a lot of Plato's ideas. But first, let me talk about, before I talk about Plato and Christianity, let me talk about Plato and Hinduism. I'm sure lots of PhD students have tried to figure out how Plato was influenced by Hinduism, because there are a lot of similar ideas. But as far as we know, historically, that didn't really happen. But let me mention two similarities. The first one, for Hindus and Plato, similarities. Both of them see the world that we don't see the ultimate reality. When we look around, we see sort of a distorted copy of reality. Recall your high school philosophy and the parable of the cave. I don't know if you remember Plato's parable of the cave, but the idea is that what we're seeing, says Plato, is shadows on the wall of the cave. We're not seeing the real tiger and trees. Those are perfect. Those tigers and those trees, the ultimate reality is perfect. You might think that they exist in the mind of God. Plato didn't quite use that language. But that's reality, not what you're seeing. To the Hindus, it's the idea of Maya. You're not seeing actual reality. You're seeing something like a distorted copy of it. Another similarity, I mentioned the idea of the soul. Remember, the soul in Hinduism is that passes from one individual when that person dies to another individual through reincarnation. For Plato, it's a much more abstract idea. The soul pre-exists the individual and just lives on. Christians rejected that notion of Plato. They tried to accept there was a lot of effort by early Christians to have some sort of intellectual pedigree, to try to get some standing in the world. And how do you better to get intellectual standing in the world and say, I'm relying on Plato, or I'm relying on Aristotle. But they changed a lot of ideas, including the soul. The soul is, forget the universal soul that pre-exists the individual now. For Christians, the soul emerges with the individual. and then stays with that individual. And when he dies, if he's saved, that soul lives on in the form of heaven. One more similarity that I want to talk about Judaism is the idea, where do we get truth? Now, the Greeks, particularly Plato, would say that we get it through reason. We get it through thinking, but we think it through in a very logical, sophisticated, philosophical way. And not everybody's capable of doing that. The philosophers are capable of doing that. You have to have a well-trained mind to do that. But if you have a well-trained mind, you can reach the truth that way. Aristotle, much more empirical later. How's that different from Hinduism? You don't have to be a philosopher. The truth comes through meditation and through reflection. Similar for Buddhists. The truth is internal. Open to everyone, if you can think it through. Now, let me turn to Judaism. Again, this is happening. Doesn't seem so far away to us now geographically, but at the time it was far. You've got India to the east, and then you've got what's happening around the Mediterranean, Palestine. A fundamental idea, and probably give credit to the Jews as much as anyone, it's the idea of one God. That's a conceptual leap, whether you believe it or not. It's a big jump from a culture that believed in many gods. Remember the early religion, primitive religion, there were not necessarily anthropomorphic gods, but spirits and trees and rocks all around us. The world was full of spirits. Not so much to the Jews. Now, probably they began with a principal God and lesser gods. You remember when Moses came down from Mount Sinai and the Jews were supposed to be worshiping the one God, and they had a golden calf. They were worshiping another God, and Moses was very unhappy about that. So that is what was left of that system of maybe a major God and many other and minor gods. And some notion that after the Babylonian captivity and when the Jews returned to Palestine, that the philosopher or the prophet said, "Forget that multiple God thing. That's sent us in the wrong direction. There's one God, and you've got to worship that one God." Now, that's, of course, a mainstay of Judaism then and today. And you see that in the Jewish community that's so tightly bound together through that central belief, through dietary laws, some things that we might seem a little odd to us, circumcision and dietary laws, things that were not very attractive to others. Maybe they were central because they were not attractive to each other. Jews have never been big proselytizers. They don't go on big campaigns to recruit people like Christians do and Muslims do. That's not their thing. Now, the Jews have survived as a relatively small community in the world, enormously influential, but a small community, really, but have done that through those very tight ties of community. You see that now in the reaction to what's happening to them. Now we get 500 years after the Torah, Jesus is born. Jesus lived maybe 30 years. Very charismatic, obviously very inspiring to a lot of people, to be remembered and had so much influence, but he lived a relatively short life. Very simple theology. Love your neighbor as yourself. Pretty simple. When he died, the Jesus movement that emerged from that, that's what became Christianity. Not simple at all. Why so complicated? A lot of the complexity was how to think of Jesus. How do we characterize Jesus? Was he a human? Was he God? Was he some combination? The idea of the Trinity, exactly. And, you know, you can see the struggles in the early church. They're about that. Those are about that ideas. You know, you might think, well, I see why you might have a debate in some advanced course in divinity school or something, but this is everybody. This is at the heart of Christianity and what the fight was all about. 600 years later, Muhammad is born. Think about that time scale. That is Muhammad, and the legend of Muhammad, born in the Arabian Peninsula, where the fighting is going on right now. And probably in a sort of a pagan, early pagan kind of religious environment. His insight, or at least influenced by the Quran, was to start something entirely new. Well, I shouldn't say that. Start new from his environment, but adopt portions of Judaism and Christianity, which is what Islam is. Jesus shows up in the Quran. Jesus shows up in Islam. The Jewish prophets show up there. Jesus is not a divine. He's not the Son of God. There is no divine Son of God for Islam. But he maintained the idea of one God. He made that. Think about those core things I was telling you about as far as the core of Western religion as opposed to Eastern religion. There is one God. And he or it is a part of a personal God. Where he is hard to say, but he or she or it listens to us and has commandments for us and tells us how to live. That's not Brahman. Brahman is all of reality. So, where does that take us today? Let's conclude this way and let's take a time for discussion. Hinduism still dominant in India. Buddhism as it moved east tended to merge with indigenous religions like Shinto in Japan. But we still have these big differences. We still have the Western idea of a personal God that knows us and listens to us and has commands and rules for living and is not all of reality, but is something much more personal. Whereas in the East, you have Brahman. We have individuals' souls who, in the Christian world, survive their death if they have salvation, but that soul is linked to that one individual. Whereas in the East, we have notions of the soul moving from one to another. Now, there's much to be admired about both sides of this, if we want to call it a debate, not really a debate, but these different perspectives. I think an unfortunate difference is that is this. In the East, there's a tendency to say there are many paths to enlightenment. Whereas in the West, there's a tendency to say there's one path. And my truth is your truth. All right, thanks.
Well, thank you, Eddie.
You're welcome.
And we have time if anyone has a comment or a question.
I would like you to talk about the differences between the Western development of the church with all of its doctrine and power and money versus in the East, temple worship.
Yes.
And how does power and doctrine relate between the two sides?
Well, that's a very major point. I'm glad you brought it up. Early on, Christianity was a struggling minor, sect. That's amazing. It's kind of a fluke that it emerged to survive. One big reason it survived was it was attractive to the Roman emperors. Constantine became a Christian, and there's a legend of why he did. But then Theodosius, a subsequent emperor, made it the official religion of the Roman Empire. And boy, nothing like that to get you off and running, to have the Roman emperor require you to, or tell you that you're the one. Anyway, what emerged from that, it took some centuries, was the Catholic Church. And Catholic means universal. That was the church. And that became the powerful institution, still is today, more powerful then probably, because it's so dominant. For centuries, it was the debate about who's stronger, the Pope or the kings or the monarchs. And some of the time, the popes did very well in that struggle. But that became the source of this powerful idea of the church with rules for you. And how do you find out what the truth is? You ask the priest. You don't go figure it out by yourself. What disrupted that? Martin Luther. Because Martin Luther said enough of that, you can figure it out on your own. You got to read the scriptures. But that's why you have this powerful tradition in the West. In the East, there were some powerful temples, and the Indian government began to subsidize Hinduism later. But the tradition still is you don't have big churches. The temples, if you go look in Japan at temples, they're ceremonial sites to go look at. They're not organized churches. So what's religion for a lot of people in the East is your altar at home, not the big 3,000 seat auditorium in Dallas. No, you don't see that.
Thank you very much, Eddie. I really enjoyed that, and I've been looking forward to it. Yeah, I think you did a masterful job. I have two questions or two comments. One is in regard to what the question you just had. I'd been thinking about that a lot, and I think Augustine kind of codified it when he wrote the City of God and said there's an earthly city and there's a heavenly city. And the church was the earthly city, and therefore that was the one. And you're right. I mean, it was the Caesar of Papism said, I'm the emperor, I'm also the chief of the church, so bow down. The other question I have, though, is what happened in China? That China kind of, toyed with Buddhism and what have you, but then rejected it kind of in favor of a couple of philosophies kind of absent of any divine presence.
Yeah. As far as, let me talk about Augustine for a moment. I think the Pope is an Augustinian or something like that. Or if you read what Augustine was concerned about, what's he concerned about? Women staying virgins, and avoiding sex. And it's not about how the poor and how the world can be a better place. I mean, it's a narrow conception of what the church is all about. I think Bertrand Russell says you read Augustine, and it's no surprise that the next 1,000 years were some of the darkest, most primitive in the history of the world. But you're right. There's the big difference: city of God and the city of the world. I'm not as very familiar with the development in China, except you raise an interesting point, which I didn't say anything about, is the wisdom traditions in China. Confucius, Lao Tse, where you could even debate whether that's religion or not. But it's, to me, it occupies the same role of the framework of what someone thinks, what these brilliant people thought were the highest way to live. Confucius, we have these network of relationships, and the monarch has to be the one that shows the highest values of all. So, but that's going on too. Now, what I really know even less about is what the Chinese government, what the communist government did to Buddhism, and whether it restricted it or not on the grounds it was a threat to the authority of China. I have a feeling there's something there, but I don't know much about it.
As always, very interesting talk. Appreciate it.
Sure.
It seems to me that when you look at the world's religions, there's always been a need for believing in something, worshiping something, and that all of these religions sort of worship to have some entity intercede for them, and in times of trouble and whatnot, with the exception, I think, of Buddhism, which is, to me, trying to set up a way of life, a lifestyle.
Yeah. No, I agree with you that Buddhism is different, seems to be different than all of them, because it's so a simple formula. This is the Buddha himself who, as you know, wandered for a long time before he finally was enlightened. To say that, here's the problem. It's desire, You give up desire, you're able to get on top of that, you can be free. Now, it's not that easy to do, but I agree. It's not as complex as other religions. Now, but to go back to your first point, why do we have religion in the first place? Well, yeah, people, they want to have some explanation, for what is happening to me, And why do we have suffering? And why are my loved ones dying? Why do I have to die? And it gives them something to hang on to. And the leaders trying to keep order, they like it too, because it helps keep order. And no doubt both of those things are going on.
It appeared that Buddhism originated in India, and Hinduism came along. Why did Hinduism sort of overtake Buddhism? Is it just because of that need for?
Well, keep in mind, here's
God
the
to worship?
timeline. Here comes, Hinduism starts early, 1500 BCE, in India. Buddha lives the 6th century. He emerges out of that, but goes in a very different direction. His ideas go east. His ideas go to China and to the countries of the East. And maybe if there had been somebody wise that would have gone to the East and sold Hinduism, maybe, but I don't know. But his in a way, talking about simple theology, his simple theology turned out to be very, very attractive at that time. There are theories, all these counter-historical examples, where do they get you? That, what if Buddha had gone west, What if he'd gone to the Mediterranean? Maybe we'd have a different world.
I don't really have a question. I just have some observations that I would like us all to consider, because they're making me feel some kind of way.
Okay.
Okay. As I'm looking here and I'm thinking about what we've talked about, I've heard the names of Brahma and Siddhartha Gautama and Homer and Plato and Aristotle and Abraham and Jesus and Peter and Augustine and Muhammad. And I want you to think about that, what they have in common. And I counted in here, we have 34 people, and this is a very progressive religious organization for this world. And 10 of these people are male. And I've read a book called When God Was a Woman, and it talks about how there are millions and millions of these statuettes of goddesses that date back as early as 40,000 BCE. And because the archaeologists of the time that were finding them were coming from a certain place in their ideology, they assumed that because they were female, they had to be cults. So I just want to leave you with that and have you consider that a little bit.
All right. Well, there's certainly a very dramatic absence of early religious leaders who are women. That's true. I don't really know how to explain that fully.
Did you ever read the book Gnostic Gospels?
No.
Elaine Pagels. Take a look at that. That Gnostic, Gnostic Gospels by Elaine Pagels, Pagels. That will help. It will send you into other places. My question is, have you looked at all about the Aztecs and how they fit into this timeline, and how did they, I don't know when I haven't looked, so I don't know when that whole group, but it's so different from the Eastern and Westerns, and how did that get, into the Western Hemisphere?
Well, the way it got into the Western Hemisphere, if you know the migration patterns,
Yeah.
We probably all emerged from Africa into Asia and into Europe, eventually into Siberia, across the Bering Strait, down the North America, into North America, South America, maybe 13,000 BCE. So that is a very late cultural development to have people in the Americas, just for starters. And I would guess they have some of the similarities to other indigenous religions. It's very nature-based, spirits in the living things and in other things. And then the gods emerge from that idea. But I don't really know that much about Aztec religion. But that's the timeline we're talking about. Yeah. All right. Thanks, guys.
Yep.